From flight attendants unlocking lavatory doors from the outside to pilots being banned from eating the same meal, aviation is full of hidden secrets. We're breaking down the surprising realities of flying. Keep watching, because one invisible phenomenon is making flights more dangerous than ever. That little occupied sign gives you a feeling of total privacy. It is, in plain terms, a comfortable illusion. Cabin crew can open a locked lavatory door from the outside in seconds, and they do it routinely. The mechanism sits in plain sight. On most aircraft, the small no smoking placard or flap mounted on the outside of the door lifts upward. Behind it is the other end of the same bolt you slid shut from inside the room. A crew member lifts that flap, slides the external latch across, and the door swings open. There is no key, no code, no tool involved. The lock that feels like a private fortress is really a simple two-sided switch. This is not an oversight or a design defect. It is a deliberate safety feature present on virtually every commercial jet, and the reasons behind it are entirely practical, rather than sinister or secretive in intent. People lock themselves in and then faint, collapse, or fall seriously ill. Children get stuck inside. Passengers occasionally try to smoke, or do worse behind the one door on board that actually locks. The crew needs guaranteed access to every space. An emergency at 35,000 feet cannot wait for a locksmith. So the bathroom was engineered so the people responsible for your safety can never be shut out of it, regardless of what is happening on the other side. The crew treats it as an access necessity rather than an intrusion, reaching for the flap only when a passenger inside has stopped responding to repeated knocks and calls. There is a quieter implication that unsettles frequent flyers the moment they hear it. The privacy you assume in that small room is conditional. It exists only because nobody on the crew currently has a reason to come in. For the overwhelming majority of flights, that distinction never matters at all. The flap stays down, the latch stays untouched, and the system simply waits in the background as a silent contingency for the one rare moment it is genuinely needed, invisible and forgotten until the second it suddenly matters to someone's survival. But if the lock built to protect you is really a switch the crew controls, it raises an obvious question about everything else. What about the equipment meant to save your life? The gear that on every airliner was deliberately left out. Somewhere in your mind is the assumption that in a true catastrophe, something would save you. There is no such thing in the cabin. Commercial airliners carry 0 parachutes for passengers, and that is a deliberate decision, not an oversight. The reasoning fits the title precisely. This is a piece of safety logic the industry never explains to the people sitting in the seats. Airlines decided long ago that parachutes would make a disaster more deadly, not less, so they simply removed them from the conversation. Start with the door. At cruise altitude, the cabin is pressurized far above the thin outside air, and that pressure presses the plug-type doors firmly into their frames. One person pulling a handle cannot open them in flight. Even if a door somehow opened, the conditions outside are lethal in their own right. The air is too thin to breathe, the temperature is far below freezing, and the wind at cruising speed would tear at anyone standing in the opening. Then consider the people. A skydiver trains for many jumps before going solo, yet a packed airliner holds hundreds of passengers with no training whatsoever. Handing them chutes and instructions mid-emergency would create chaos, not survivors, in the few seconds available. There is also the simple matter of weight and physics. Hundreds of parachutes add enormous bulk and cost to every single flight. For gear that could only ever be used in a vanishingly rare scenario, the design already works hard to prevent. And every extra kilogram on board means more fuel burned across millions of routine, uneventful flights. That scenario is rarer than most passengers assume. Total loss of control during cruise. The only phase where a jump might even be imagined almost never happens, because the aircraft is built with layers of redundant engines, systems, and backups. The accidents that do occur cluster around takeoff, the initial climb, the approach, and the landing. In those moments, the plane is low, fast, and close to the ground, where a parachute would be completely useless even in theory. So the absence of chutes is a verdict, not a gap. The engineers concluded they would do more harm than good, which leads to the one piece of survival gear that does drop down in front of you, and how violently it actually works. The yellow mask that falls from the ceiling looks gentle, almost reassuring. The reality is harsher. Those masks are fed not by a tank of stored air, but by a small chemical generator that ignites a reaction when you pull the mask toward you. This is the title in action. Nobody on the flight ever tells you that the device keeping you conscious works by setting off a controlled chemical burn directly above your head, producing breathable oxygen rather than simply releasing it from a cylinder. When you pull the mask, you trigger a reaction, typically using a sodium chlorate or perchlorate compound that releases oxygen as it burns. The unit gets genuinely hot, and the process can produce a faint burning or dirty sock smell that is entirely normal. That smell has frightened plenty of passengers who assumed the plane was on fire. It is not. The odor is simply the byproduct of the generator doing its job, and the heat is a sign the chemistry is working exactly as intended. The supply is deliberately brief. Each generator produces oxygen for only about 12 to 20 minutes, not because the engineers were stingy, but because that window is all the pilots need to descend the aircraft to a lower altitude where the air is breathable on its own. There is usually one extra mask per row, because a single generator often feeds several masks at once. The system is designed for the row, not strictly for the seat, so a middle passenger is never left without a supply, and a parent reaching across to a child finds the spare already waiting where it is needed most. Now, the rule that feels cruel until you understand it. You must secure your own mask before helping anyone else, including your own child, and there is a brutal record behind that instruction worth remembering. At cruise altitude, the loss of cabin pressure leaves a person with a window of useful consciousness of roughly 15 to 30 seconds. Reach across to help a child first, and you may pass out before either of you is breathing, dooming you both. So the counterintuitive order, yourself, then others, is the only version that keeps people alive. It is the kind of cold, practical truth the cabin hides behind a calm voice. And some truths ride below the cabin entirely, in cargo, where the freight is occasionally human. Below the polished cabin in the cargo hold, freight is loaded that the passengers above will never see, and the crew almost never mentions aloud. Some of that freight on a quiet number of flights is human remains being carried to a final destination. This belongs on the list because of how thoroughly it is concealed from the people sitting overhead. A funeral, a grieving family, and a transfer across the country can all be happening in the belly of your aircraft while you scroll through the in-flight menu, entirely unaware. Ground crews and ramp agents handle these movements constantly. Insider accounts from airline workers describe transporting human remains as a routine, if solemn part of cargo operations, logged and tracked like any other special shipment with its own careful procedures. The remains are referred to on manifests and over the radio by a short, clinical code rather than spoken about openly. The abbreviation keeps the communication efficient and discreet, sparing both the workers and any nearby passengers from a blunt announcement of what is being loaded. There is a quiet dignity built into the handling. Crews are trained to move these shipments with care and respect, and many describe a deliberate, hushed seriousness whenever such cargo is brought to or from the aircraft on the tarmac. It is one of the strange dualities of flight. The same machine carrying a couple to a wedding can be carrying someone home for a funeral. The two journeys separated only by a cabin floor and a polite silence that the crew maintains with practiced, deliberate care from the moment the freight is loaded. For the people who work the ramp, it becomes ordinary in the way difficult jobs do, folded into a shift alongside luggage, mail, and freight. The contrast that strikes outsiders barely registers once you have done it 100 times. For the passengers, the secrecy is largely a kindness. Knowing the details would change nothing about the flight, and the coded language exists in part so that an ordinary trip is not interrupted by an uncomfortable reminder of mortality at the gate. So the floor beneath your feet hides one secret world. But there is another hidden chamber on long flights, and this one sits above your head, a place built not for the dead, but for the exhausted crew you assume never sleep. On a long-haul flight, you might never wonder where the crew disappears to for hours at a time. The answer is hidden above or behind the cabin. Concealed crew rest compartments fitted with bunk beds, tucked into spaces passengers walk past without noticing. This earns its place because the door is designed to be invisible. On many wide-body jets, a small, unremarkable panel, sometimes disguised as a closet or a section of bulkhead, opens onto a hidden staircase or hatch leading to a private sleeping area. Inside, the compartments are surprisingly complete. They contain rows of bunks, their own temperature controls, dim lighting, and sometimes basic facilities, all built into the curve of the fuselage where there is no room for paying seats. The reason these rooms exist is not luxury, but law and biology. On the longest routes, pilots and flight attendants are required to rest, because fatigue at the controls or in the cabin is a genuine safety hazard that regulators take seriously. So the airline builds the crew a place to genuinely sleep, not merely doze in a jump seat. A pilot can hand the flight to colleagues, climb into a bunk above the cabin, and get real rest before returning to the flight deck for landing. For flight attendants, the rest area offers a brief escape from the relentless demands of the aisle. The call bells, the meal service, the questions, and the turbulence. It is the one space on board where the crew can simply close their eyes. Passengers who learn about these compartments are often genuinely startled. The idea that a hidden dormitory has been riding a few feet from their seat, complete with beds, blankets, and a door they never noticed, feels like discovering a secret room in a familiar house. The location varies by aircraft. Some rest areas sit above the main cabin, reached by a narrow staircase. Others are tucked below deck or behind a galley wall. In every case, the design priority is the same. Keep them discreet and out of the passenger flow. Hidden behind a door no traveler thinks to open. These hidden rooms reveal a comforting truth. The people flying you are rested by design. But the same machine that builds bedrooms into its ceiling will also, perfectly legally, take off with parts that are broken. And mechanics have a phrase for how little a plane truly needs. Here is a thought to sit with on your next departure. The aircraft you're boarding may be flying with components that are inoperative, deferred, or quietly taped together, and all of it is completely legal under aviation rules. This is one of the most disorienting secrets in the entire cabin, because it inverts the assumption that a plane must be flawless to fly. Aircraft can legally operate with certain non-critical systems inoperative under what is called the Minimum Equipment List, or MEL. The MEL is a precise approved document listing exactly which items may be broken and still permit a safe flight. The logic rests entirely on redundancy. If a system has multiple backups, losing one of them does not compromise the layered safety net keeping the jet aloft. Mechanics speak about this with a kind of dark wonder. Workers have described being amazed at what you don't really need to make a plane fly, precisely because so many of the aircraft systems exist as second, third, or fourth lines of defense. Then there is the tape. The shiny silver speed tape you might glimpse on a panel is not duct tape from a hardware store. It is an aviation-grade aluminum tape, approved for temporary repairs on certain non-structural surfaces until a permanent fix is scheduled. Even small missing fasteners or screws can be permitted within strict limits, because a panel held by dozens of screws does not fail because one is absent. Every deferral is documented, signed off, and bound by tight engineering tolerances rather than guesswork. To an outsider, flying with broken parts sounds reckless. To the system, it is the opposite proof that the aircraft is so overbuilt, that the loss of a redundant component changes nothing about its ability to fly safely to the destination. That over-engineering is the quiet hero of commercial aviation. The reason single failures so rarely become disasters is that almost nothing on the jet depends on a single part working perfectly, which is exactly why deferrals can be tolerated at all, and why a missing screw alarms passengers far more than it alarms the engineers who signed it off. So the next time you spot tape on a wing or learn a system was deferred, the correct reaction may be reassurance, not fear. And speaking of small details hiding in plain sight, look closely at your window and you will find a tiny hole that is doing something vital. Press your face to the window on your next flight and look at the bottom of the pane. There is a small hole there, and most passengers assume it is a defect, a crack, or a manufacturing mistake. It is none of those things. It belongs on this list because it is a perfect example of invisible engineering, a deliberate solution to a dangerous physics problem hiding in a feature you have stared through 100 times without ever questioning what it does. Your window is not a single sheet of glass, but a system of multiple panes, with a small breather hole in the middle pane. That little hole is doing constant silent work every time the aircraft climbs and descends. The job is pressure management. As the plane ascends, the difference between the pressurized cabin and the thin air outside grows enormous, and that difference would otherwise stress the window panes severely as it builds toward cruise altitude. The breather hole lets the middle pane equalize that pressure, ensuring the strong outer pane bears the load rather than the inner one. It channels the stress to the part of the window built to handle it and away from the part that is not. It also serves a second, quieter purpose. It allows moisture to escape from the gap between the panes. Without it, condensation could collect and freeze, fogging or frosting the window in the cold of high altitude and ruining your view entirely, which is why the panes stay clear even as the air outside drops far below freezing. The inner pane you actually touch is mostly there for protection and comfort. It shields the load-bearing panes from fingerprints, scratches, and curious passengers, while the outer pane and the breather hole quietly manage the real forces involved. So that flaw is in fact one of the most elegant features on the aircraft, a tiny detail that prevents a structural problem you would never think about. Once you know it is there, you cannot stop seeing it on every flight. It is a reminder that the cabin is full of intentional choices disguised as ordinary objects, and the most powerful presence on board is not an object at all, but a person, one whose authority, the moment the doors seal, expands in ways most passengers would scarcely believe. We tend to think of the captain as a skilled driver of the aircraft, a professional at the controls. The reality is far larger. Once the doors close, the pilot in command holds sweeping legal authority over everyone and everything on board. This makes the list because the scope of that power is genuinely startling to passengers. The captain is, in a meaningful legal sense, the ultimate authority on that flight, closer to a ship's captain on the open sea than to any ordinary employee. That authority kicks in the moment the aircraft door is shut for departure. From that point, the person in the left seat is responsible for the safety, conduct, and order of every soul on the plane and is empowered to act accordingly. The practical reach of this is broad. A captain can direct that an unruly or dangerous passenger be restrained for the safety of the flight, and the crew acts on that authority rather than improvising on their own judgment alone. In extreme situations, the powers extend into territory that sounds almost medieval. Historically, a pilot in command's authority has been understood to cover extraordinary acts. In genuine emergencies, the captain becomes the final decision maker, when no one else can be reached at altitude. This is why crew defer to the flight deck on serious matters. The chain of command is not a courtesy, it is a structure with real legal weight, designed so that in a crisis there is never any confusion about who is ultimately in charge, and so that decisions made at altitude carry the same authority as any made on the ground. The reason for concentrating power this way is simple. At altitude, there are no police, no courts, and no managers to consult. Decisions must be made immediately by someone with the authority to make them stick, and that someone is the captain. It is a deliberate trade. We accept enormous authority in one person precisely because the environment allows no time for committees, and the alternative, a cabin with no final decision maker, during an emergency would be vastly more dangerous than the concentration of power. So the calm voice on the intercom belongs to someone with more authority over your immediate fate than almost anyone else you will encounter that day. And that authority is exercised through a hidden language, a set of chimes and signals the crew trade right over your head. You have heard them on every flight. The soft electronic chimes that punctuate the cabin. Most passengers tune them out as background noise or assume they simply mark the seatbelt sign. In truth, those chimes are a coded language the crew uses to communicate. This belongs on the list because the sounds you ignore are often carrying real information. Between crew members, the number of chimes, their tone, and their sequence can each signal a specific message that the cabin crew instantly understands and you never decode. The system exists because a flight is a busy, noisy environment where the crew cannot always shout across the aisle or pick up a handset. A discrete pattern of tones lets them pass information quickly without alarming the passengers around them. The meanings vary by airline and aircraft, but the principle is consistent. A particular chime might signal that the seatbelt sign has changed, that the flight deck wants to speak with the cabin, or that the crew should prepare for a phase of flight. Other patterns coordinate the everyday rhythm of service, calls between galley stations, requests for assistance, or readiness checks before descent. What sounds to you like random dings is, to the crew, a steady stream of operational shorthand, each tone slotting into a routine they have rehearsed across thousands of flights until it is second nature. Some sequences carry more weight. Certain coded chimes can alert the crew to a developing situation, turbulence ahead, a medical concern, or a need to gather, allowing them to respond and prepare before passengers even sense that anything is happening. This is part of why the crew sometimes seems to move with quiet purpose just before something occurs. They are not psychic. They have simply received a signal you could not interpret, and they are acting on information that traveled silently through the cabin. The codes also keep the cabin calm. By communicating through tones rather than announcements, the crew can manage problems discreetly, sparing passengers unnecessary anxiety over situations that are being handled long before they would ever become visible. So the soundtrack of your flight is really a conversation you are not part of, conducted in plain hearing. And the crew uses more than sound to manage you. They use light itself, dimming the cabin at very specific moments for a reason that has nothing to do with mood. On a night flight, the cabin lights dim, just before takeoff and again before landing, and the crew may ask you to raise your window shades. Most passengers assume this is about creating a relaxing, low-lit atmosphere. The real reason is survival. This makes the list because the explanation is so much more serious than the soothing impression it gives. The lights are dimmed specifically to help your eyes adjust to darkness. During the two most dangerous phases of any flight, takeoff and landing, are when the statistical risk of an accident is highest. By darkening the cabin in advance, the crew ensures that if an emergency evacuation becomes necessary, your eyes are already adapted to low light and you can see the exits and obstacles. Human vision takes precious time to adjust from bright light to darkness. If the cabin were brightly lit and an evacuation suddenly began in the dark, passengers would be momentarily blinded, fumbling for exits in the critical seconds when speed saves lives. Dimming the lights ahead of time removes that delay. Your eyes are pre-adjusted, the illuminated floor path lighting and exit signs stand out clearly, and you can orient yourself the instant you need to move rather than waiting for your vision to catch up. The raised window shades serve a parallel purpose. With the shades up, both the crew and the passengers can see outside, assessing conditions, spotting fire, smoke, or hazards on a particular side, and choosing exits that lead away from danger rather than toward it. It also lets rescuers and crew see into the cabin from outside and helps everyone understand the orientation of the aircraft relative to the ground in those disorienting first moments after an incident on the runway, when a clear view through the windows can shape every split-second decision about where to send people. None of this is mentioned in the gentle request to lower the cabin lighting. The language is calm precisely because the procedure is built for catastrophe, and the airline has no interest in narrating the worst-case scenario to a cabin full of relaxed travelers. So the cozy dimness you settle into is actually a quiet act of preparation for the unthinkable. The crew reads the cabin for danger using their eyes, and to do that quickly, they rely on small markings near the windows that most passengers never even notice. Walk down the aisle and glance at the cabin wall just above certain windows. On many aircraft, you will find small black triangles marked there. They look decorative or arbitrary, and almost no passenger knows what they are for. They are anything but random. This belongs on the list because those little triangles are functional crew markers, deliberately placed to do a specific job. The black triangles mark the seats with the clearest view of the wing, giving the crew a precise reference point along the cabin. The most important reason involves the wings. From the seats beneath those triangles, a crew member gets the best possible sightline to inspect the leading and trailing edges of the wing, including the moving surfaces that extend and retract during flight. When a pilot or flight attendant needs to visually check the wing, perhaps to confirm that flaps or slats have deployed correctly, or to look for ice damage or a fuel leak, they head to the seat marked by the triangle for the clearest view. That sightline matters at critical moments. Before landing, for instance, the crew may want to verify that the wing surfaces are configured properly, and the triangle tells them exactly where to stand or sit to make that observation without guesswork. The markers also help the crew orient themselves to overwing exits and the structure around them, so that in an emergency they can quickly locate the right reference points along the cabin, rather than searching row by row, saving seconds that could matter enormously when an evacuation is underway. It is a small piece of standardization that turns a long tube of identical windows into a navigable space. Instead of describing a vague window near the middle, the crew has a fixed, unmistakable marker that means the same thing on every flight. Once you know what they mean, the triangles stop being mysterious smudges and become evidence of how methodically the cabin is designed. Every odd detail tends to have a quiet, practical purpose hiding behind it, waiting to be explained. So even the wall above your window is part of the operational system. That same careful, redundant thinking extends to the flight deck itself, including a rule about what the two pilots are allowed to eat, designed to guard against a danger you would never suspect. Up in the flight deck, a small rule quietly governs the pilot's meals, and it has nothing to do with taste or preference. The captain and first officer are generally required or strongly encouraged to eat different meals from each other during the flight. This makes the list because the reasoning is unsettling once you grasp it. The entire point is to protect against food poisoning. If both pilots ate the same dish and it were contaminated, both could be incapacitated at the same time. A genuine catastrophe. By eating different meals, the pilots ensure that a bad batch of food can only ever take down one of them at once. The other remains healthy and capable of flying the aircraft safely, preserving the redundancy that defines aviation safety. It is the same philosophy that governs the rest of the machine, applied to the human beings at the controls, just as the aircraft has backup systems. The flight deck maintains a backup pilot, whose ability to fly must never be compromised by a shared risk. The threat is not hypothetical. There have been documented incidents over aviation history in which flight crews suffered food-related illness, and the lesson was clear enough that the practice of staggering pilot meals became a sensible, widely followed precaution. The rule sometimes extends to timing as well. Pilots may eat at slightly different points in the flight, so that even if a problem emerges, it does not strike both crew members simultaneously while the aircraft is in a demanding phase, leaving at least one set of hands fully capable at all times. Passengers, meanwhile, eat identical meals by the hundreds without a second thought, because a single sick passenger does not endanger the flight. The special handling is reserved for the two people whose simultaneous illness would be unthinkable. It is a small, almost domestic detail that reveals the depth of the safety culture. Even the lunch tray is governed by the question every aviation decision asks: what happens if this one thing goes wrong? And is there a backup ready? That same wariness extends to what the crew themselves will and won't consume on board. Because there is one thing many flight attendants quietly refuse to drink on their own aircraft, and once you hear why, you may refuse it too. Order a coffee or tea on your next flight, and you may be drinking something the crew themselves avoid. Flight attendants frequently advise sticking to sealed bottled beverages rather than anything made from the plane's water tanks, and many follow that rule strictly themselves. This belongs on the list because it is advice the crew gives quietly, not over the intercom. The aircraft's potable water system, the tanks and lines that supply the galleys and taps, is regulated, but its real-world cleanliness can vary in ways that concern the people who work around it. Those tanks are filled, drained, and cleaned on schedules, but they sit in a complex system of pipes that is difficult to monitor perfectly between flights. The result is that water quality is not guaranteed to be as pristine as the gleaming galley suggests. The specific worry is what can accumulate inside the lines and tanks over time. Crew reports and studies have raised concerns about microbial contamination in some onboard water systems, which is precisely why the simple stick-to-bottled advice persists among experienced staff. That caution extends to one detail many passengers miss: the ice. Ice cubes are typically made from the same onboard water supply, so a bottled drink poured over plain ice may quietly reintroduce the very water you were trying to avoid. Hot drinks deserve their own note. Coffee and tea are brewed from the tank water, and brewing temperatures do not always reach a rolling boil for long enough to fully sterilize whatever may be present, leaving the crew's preference for sealed options well-founded even on the warmest drink in the galley. None of this means the water will harm you, and most passengers drink it for years without any issue at all. But the crew's habit reflects a precautionary instinct. When in doubt, choose the sealed bottle whose source you can actually verify. It is one of those insider behaviors that, once noticed, is hard to unsee. Watch closely and you will spot crew members reaching for bottled water while serving tap-based drinks to the cabin, a small telling gap between what is offered and what is chosen. So the cleanest choice in the cabin may be the one in your own sealed bottle. And while you weigh the risks inside the aircraft, the fuselage outside is routinely struck by one of nature's most violent forces, and the plane barely notices. It is one of the most common fears at the window seat, a bolt of lightning splitting the dark sky beside the wing. Here is the secret that should settle that fear. Commercial jets are struck by lightning on average roughly once a year, and they shrug it off. This makes the list because the contrast between the fear and the reality is so stark. A lightning strike sounds like a disaster movie. In practice, it is a routine event that the aircraft is specifically engineered to absorb without harm to anyone aboard. The secret is in the structure. The aircraft's conductive metal skin acts like a Faraday cage, channeling the enormous electrical current around the outside of the fuselage and away from the passengers, the fuel, and the sensitive systems within. When lightning strikes, it typically enters at one extremity, a wingtip or the nose, travels along the conductive skin, and exits at another point, often a wingtip or the tail, without ever passing through the cabin where the people are sitting. To manage that exit, aircraft are fitted with small devices called static wicks, the little spikes you can see trailing from the wings and tail. They help discharge built-up static electricity and the current of a strike safely into the air behind the plane. The critical systems are protected and shielded so that a strike does not knock out the avionics or ignite the fuel. Engineers design and test for this deliberately, treating a lightning hit not as a freak event but as a normal condition the aircraft must tolerate, certifying each model against strikes before it ever carries a passenger. After a strike, the crew may not even mention it, or may note it calmly. The aircraft is inspected for any minor burn marks at the entry and exit points once on the ground, but flights routinely continue and land without incident. So that terrifying flash you see is, to the machine, a non-event it was built to handle. The fear is human and understandable. The engineering simply outpaces it, turning a primal threat into a footnote in the maintenance log. That reassurance is a good moment to ease the tension, because not every secret onboard is about danger. Some are small mercies hidden in your own seat, like the button beneath your armrest that can quietly hand you more space. Here is a secret that can directly improve your next flight. On many aircraft, the aisle armrest hides a small button or lever underneath that lets it lift fully upright, out of the way, and most passengers never know it is there. This belongs on the list precisely because it is so useful and so well hidden. The aisle armrest usually feels permanently fixed in place, an immovable barrier. But for many seats, that is an illusion created by a release mechanism tucked just out of sight. Reach underneath toward the hinge near the seat back, and you will often find a small recessed button or catch. Press it, and the armrest swings up flush with the seat back, opening the seat to the aisle without any awkward wrestling. The feature exists for genuinely important reasons. It allows passengers with limited mobility to transfer into and out of the seat more easily, and it gives the crew a way to assist anyone who needs help moving without the armrest blocking the path. For the rest of us, it is simply a quality of life upgrade. On a flight with empty middle seats, lifting the armrests lets you stretch across the row and lie down, transforming a cramped economy bench into something approaching a narrow bed. It also makes boarding and deplaning smoother in tight spaces, easing the perennial struggle of squeezing past an armrest with a bag in hand. Once you know the release is there, the whole seat feels less like a fixed cage, and more like adjustable furniture you are quietly allowed to reconfigure for yourself. The reason it stays hidden is mostly practical. The button is recessed to prevent accidental activation, and the crew does not advertise it because not every seat has it, and they would rather avoid confusion or a cabin full of people fiddling with their armrests. So consider this your quiet permission to investigate. Run your fingers beneath the aisle armrest near the back of the seat, and you may discover a small comfort the airline never thought to mention to you. While you are enjoying that bit of extra space, remember that the crew is doing something with their eyes the entire time you board, quietly assessing every single passenger who steps onto the aircraft, including you, against a list of things they have been trained to look for. That warm greeting at the aircraft door is sincere, but it is also doing double duty. As you step aboard, the flight attendants are quietly assessing every passenger, your behavior, your condition, and whether you might pose a risk or need extra help. This makes the list because the friendly smile masks a trained, deliberate evaluation. In the few seconds it takes you to pass, the crew is forming impressions that may shape how they handle you for the rest of the flight. They are watching for clear safety concerns first, signs of heavy intoxication, illness or distress, agitation, or anything that suggests a passenger might become disruptive or require medical attention. Once the aircraft is sealed and airborne, they are also identifying who might need assistance. A passenger who seems frail, anxious, or unfamiliar with flying gets mentally flagged, so that the crew knows in advance who may need help with the seatbelt, the exit row, or an emergency evacuation. There's a more serious layer to this scrutiny. Through training programs designed to combat human trafficking, crews have learned to spot subtle warning signs, controlling companions, fearful or coached behavior, or a passenger who seems unable to speak or move freely. These initiatives have turned cabin crews into an unexpected line of defense. A flight attendant who notices the right combination of red flags can quietly alert authorities, and there are documented cases where exactly that attentiveness has helped intervene in a trafficking situation, with the victim never aware that a stranger's careful glance had set a rescue in motion. The assessment is constant but discreet, woven into the ordinary motions of boarding so that no passenger feels singled out unless there is a genuine reason. Most travelers pass the evaluation without ever realizing one took place at all. It reframes the boarding experience entirely. The greeting is not only hospitality, it is the opening move of a safety routine that continues until the doors open at the destination, with the crew quietly tracking who is who throughout the flight. So you are seen far more closely than you think the moment you board. And once everyone is settled, the cabin keeps a relic from a bygone era, a feature that was legally required to stay, even after the very behavior it was built for was banned. Step into an aircraft lavatory and look closely near the door. You will almost certainly find an ashtray, despite the fact that smoking has been banned on flights for decades. It seems like a baffling contradiction. There is a precise reason it remains. This belongs on the list because the ashtray's survival is not an oversight. It is required by regulation even on smoke-free aircraft. The very feature designed for smokers persists specifically because smoking is forbidden, which sounds backward until you understand the logic. The thinking is built around the assumption that someone, somewhere, will eventually break the rule. A determined passenger may light a cigarette in the lavatory despite the ban, and aviation safety planning refuses to pretend that will never happen. If that rule breaker has nowhere safe to extinguish and dispose of the cigarette, the danger multiplies. A lit cigarette stubbed out and dropped into a trash bin full of paper towels is a genuine fire hazard at altitude, where a cabin fire is among the most feared emergencies. The ashtray solves this. It gives any illicit smoker a fireproof contained place to put out and store a cigarette, dramatically reducing the chance that a moment of rule-breaking turns into a catastrophic in-flight fire far from any runway, where there is nowhere to land and no fire brigade waiting to respond. So the regulation keeps the ashtray precisely because it cannot fully prevent smoking. It is a piece of harm reduction logic frozen into the aircraft's design, anticipating human disobedience and engineering around it rather than wishing it away. It is a small monument to a different era of air travel, when cabins were filled with smoke and the ashtray was a routine fixture rather than a curious relic. The smoke is long gone, but the safety rationale outlived the habit. There is something quietly wise in it, an acknowledgement that rules alone do not guarantee compliance, and that good safety design plans for the worst version of human behavior rather than the best. The ashtray is a contingency, not a courtesy, so even a banned act has a safeguard built around it. But the lavatory's surfaces hide a different kind of threat, one you cannot see, regulate away, or stub out, lurking on the very things you touch most during the flight. Of everything you contact during a flight, you might assume the lavatory is the worst. The unsettling truth is broader. The tray table, the seatbelt buckle, the armrests, and the lavatory handles rank among the dirtiest surfaces on board, often harboring more microbes than you would ever guess. This makes the list because it overturns the obvious assumption and exposes a problem rooted in economics, not negligence. The reason these surfaces stay dirty has everything to do with the relentless pressure of the turnaround clock between flights. That tray table which you lean on, eat from, and sometimes rest your face against is touched by hundreds of strangers and rarely deep cleaned between flights. Studies and crew reports repeatedly flag it as one of the highest microbe surfaces in the entire cabin. The seatbelt buckle is another quiet culprit. Every passenger handles it, yet it is almost never wiped down in the rushed minutes between one flight and the next, allowing whatever was left behind to linger for the following travelers. The pressure comes from scheduling. Airlines profit when aircraft are flying, not sitting at gates, so turnarounds are kept as short as possible. In that narrow window, cleaning crews focus on the visible mess, trash, and crumbs, far more than on disinfecting every touchpoint. The result is that germs which can survive on surfaces, including viruses capable of causing stomach illness, may persist from one flight to the next. The seatback pocket, stuffed with old tissues and wrappers and shared blankets, are frequently flagged for the same reason, since neither is laundered or emptied during a typical quick turnaround. The practical defense is simple and entirely in your hands. A small pack of disinfecting wipes used on the tray table, buckle and armrest at the start of the flight, plus regular hand hygiene dramatically reduces your exposure to whatever the last passenger left. It is not a reason for alarm so much as a reason for awareness. The cabin is not filthy by intention. It is simply cleaned against a clock that prioritizes departure times, leaving the finer details of hygiene to the informed traveler. so the threat in the cabin is sometimes invisible and microscopic, out on the wing. By contrast, the safety gear is bright, deliberate, and waiting for a disaster most passengers never imagine. A set of hooks built for the moment the aircraft ends up on water. Look out at the wing and you may notice small yellow hooks or fittings set into its surface. They appear to be minor hardware, easy to overlook entirely. In reality, they are emergency equipment, waiting for one of aviation's most dramatic scenarios. This belongs on the list because those hooks are designed for a water landing, a ditching. The yellow hooks anchor lifelines or ropes to give evacuating passengers something to hold as they move across a slick, sloping wing toward the rafts. Picture the situation they exist for. The aircraft has come down on water. The overwing exits are open, and passengers must climb out onto a wet, possibly tilting wing surface, with nothing natural to grip as they make their way to safety. Without anchor points, that wet wing would be treacherous. A panicked passenger could easily slip off the smooth, sloping surface into the water below, turning an orderly evacuation into a series of falls at the worst possible moment. The hooks solve this by allowing the crew to string a rope or lifeline across the wing. Evacuees can then hold on as they move, steadying themselves against the slope and the slickness while making their way toward the escape slides or rafts deployed for them, turning a deadly obstacle course into a passable guided path to safety. It is the same philosophy seen throughout the aircraft. Anticipate the specific physical reality of an emergency and engineer a small concrete solution for it in advance, long before anyone ever needs it on a real flight. These features rarely see use, since survivable water landings are exceptionally rare in commercial aviation. But rare is not never, and the cost of including the hooks is trivial against the value of a single life saved during an actual ditching, which is exactly why they remain fitted on aircraft that may never touch water in their entire service life. So those unremarkable yellow fittings are a quiet promise that even the most cinematic disaster has been planned for. Every visible piece of hardware on the wing tends to be there for a reason rooted in someone's hard-won experience. That same instinct for hardening the aircraft against the worst reaches its most fortified expression at the very front of the plane, behind a door that was transformed almost overnight into one of the most secure barriers you will ever stand near. The door to the flight deck looks like an ordinary cabin door, but it is one of the most secure barriers on the entire aircraft. Since the early 2000s, reinforced cockpit doors have been mandatory, built to resist forced entry and keep the flight deck protected. This makes the list because the transformation was both rapid and permanent, and the reason is etched into modern history. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the industry hardened the cockpit door into a fortified barrier almost overnight, and it has stayed that way ever since. The doors are constructed from reinforced, intrusion-resistant materials designed to withstand attempts to break through, including resistance to physical force, and, in many designs, to small arms fire. The flimsy partition of earlier decades was replaced by something closer to a vault. The locking protocols are just as deliberate as the materials. The door is kept locked in flight, and access is governed by strict procedures and verification steps, so that no one can simply walk up and enter the flight deck on demand. There are carefully designed systems for the crew to manage entry and emergencies, controls that allow the pilots to admit colleagues while resisting unauthorized attempts, balancing the need to keep intruders out against the need for legitimate access in a crisis, all governed by procedures rehearsed so the right people get in and the wrong ones never do. This is why you may notice the crew taking precautions around the cockpit door during the flight, sometimes blocking the aisle with a cart when the door must briefly open. The whole choreography exists to preserve the security of the protected space behind it. The change represents one of the most visible ways aviation rewrote its own rules in response to tragedy. A single catastrophic day reshaped the architecture of every airliner, turning the cockpit into a sealed stronghold for the people flying the plane. For passengers, the reinforced door is mostly invisible in its effect, a quiet, constant layer of security you pass without thinking about it, doing its job precisely by never being tested on your particular flight. So the safest fortified space on the aircraft is reserved for the crew up front, but passengers have long wanted to know where the safest place is for them, and crash data points toward an answer that runs counter to where most people prefer to sit. The safest seats are at the back. It is the question almost everyone wonders but few ask aloud. Where is the safest place to sit? The answer the industry rarely volunteers may surprise you. Multiple crash analyses suggest the rear of the aircraft tends to have higher survival rates than the front in many impact scenarios. This belongs on the list because it contradicts where most passengers want to sit. The premium seats, first and business class, are at the front, yet the statistically safer real estate in several studies sits well behind them toward the tail. The reasoning is intuitive once stated. In many survivable crashes, the front of the aircraft absorbs the initial impact, while the rear sections, further from the point of collision, can fare better, giving passengers there a marginally improved chance of walking away. It is crucial to keep this in perspective. Survivability depends heavily on the specific type of accident, and there is no seat that is safe in every imaginable scenario, because the geometry of each crash is different and unpredictable. Proximity to an exit matters just as much as front versus back. Sitting within a few rows of a usable exit improves your odds in an evacuation, which is why over-wing and rear positions near exits often appear favorably in survival discussions, since the few seconds saved reaching open air can decide who gets out before conditions worsen. The honest framing is that the differences are small and the baseline is extraordinarily safe to begin with. Commercial flying is statistically among the safest forms of mass transport, so these distinctions matter at the margins rather than separating certain death from survival. Still, for those who want every edge, the takeaway is simple. A seat toward the rear, close to an exit, with the seatbelt fastened, stacks the small odds slightly in your favor without requiring any special knowledge or expense. It is the kind of detail the industry does not advertise, partly because it would unsettle premium passengers, and partly because emphasizing it could imply crashes are common, when in truth, they are vanishingly rare on modern jets. So your seat choice carries a quiet statistical weight most travelers never consider. And wherever you sit, the cabin has built in a way to keep you steady. When the aircraft starts to move violently, a hidden handrail engineered for exactly that moment. The hidden handrail under the bins. When the aircraft hits rough air and you watch a flight attendant walk the aisle without stumbling, you may wonder how they stay upright. Part of the answer is hidden in plain sight. A handrail built into the underside of the overhead bins runs along the cabin. This makes the list because the feature is designed for stability in turbulence, yet is barely noticed by passengers. Reach up toward the lower edge of the overhead compartments, and you will often feel a smooth, graspable lip or rail meant to be held. The crew relies on it constantly, moving up and down the aisle during a flight, especially when the seatbelt sign is on and the air is unsettled. They slide a hand along that rail to steady themselves against sudden jolts. They cannot always predict. For passengers, the same rail offers a crucial handhold during the most dangerous moment of all, making your way to an exit while the aircraft is moving, tilting, or shaking. Having something solid to grip can be the difference between staying on your feet and falling. It is engineered to be there without intruding on the cabin's clean lines. The designers tucked it under the bins so it disappears visually while remaining exactly where a reaching hand naturally lands, an example of form quietly serving function. The rail also helps anyone with balance difficulties navigate the narrow aisle in normal conditions, giving them continuous support from row to row, rather than forcing them to grab at seatbacks and disturb other passengers along the way, so the trip to the lavatory and back stays steady even when the air is not. Once you know it is there, you will notice the crew using it instinctively, their hands gliding along the bin edge as they move. A small habitual motion that keeps them sure-footed where an untrained passenger would wobble and grab for anything nearby. It is one more piece of the cabin's invisible support system, a feature that asks nothing of you until the moment you suddenly need it, at which point it is precisely where your hand expects to find it. That quiet readiness for the worst extends even to what happens after an accident, not just during one. Because the aircraft carries devices built specifically to survive the unsurvivable and tell investigators exactly what went wrong. And almost everything you think you know about them is wrong. The black boxes that aren't black. After any serious aviation accident, the world waits for one thing: the recovery of the black boxes. The name is one of the most persistent myths in all of aviation. These flight recorders are not black at all, but painted bright orange. Specifically so they can be spotted in wreckage. This makes the list because the misnomer hides a fascinating reality. There are actually two separate devices, and black box is a historical nickname that survived even though the equipment was deliberately colored to be as visible as possible amid debris. The first is the flight data recorder, which captures a vast stream of technical parameters. Throughout the flight, altitude, speed, control inputs, and many more, building a detailed record of exactly what the aircraft was doing at every moment leading up to an event. The second is the cockpit voice recorder, which captures the audio environment of the flight deck, the pilot's voices, their communications, alarms, and the ambient sounds. Together, the two recorders give investigators both the data and the human context of an accident. Both are built to survive almost anything. They are engineered to withstand extreme impact forces, intense fire, and the crushing pressure of deep water, protecting the recorded information through the kind of catastrophe that destroys the rest of the aircraft. They are mounted in the tail section, the part of the aircraft statistically most likely to survive an impact relatively intact, giving the recorders the best possible chance of coming through a crash with their precious data preserved for recovery, even when the rest of the airframe has been reduced to fragments. For crashes over water, the recorders carry an underwater locator beacon that activates on contact with water and emits a pinging signal for around 30 days or more, guiding search teams toward the wreckage on the seabed before the battery finally fades. The bright orange paint ties it all together. In a field of scattered, scorched debris or a stretch of dark ocean floor, a vivid orange casing is far easier for recovery teams to locate than any dark color ever could be. So the black box is orange, comes in two parts, and is built to outlast the aircraft itself. A machine designed to speak for those who cannot. And while these devices record the flight, a different system is quietly doing most of the actual flying. Who's really flying the plane? Settle into your seat with confidence in the skilled hands at the controls, and then consider an open secret of modern aviation. For most of the journey, the autopilot is doing the flying, handling the long cruise, while the human pilots monitor, manage, and stand ready. This belongs on the list because it sounds alarming and is in fact deeply reassuring. The pilots are not asleep at the wheel. The autopilot is a tool that frees them from the fatigue of hand flying, so they can focus on the decisions that actually matter. During the cruise, the long, steady middle of the flight, the autopilot holds the heading, altitude, and speed with a precision and tirelessness no human could sustain for hours. The pilots supervise it, watching the systems, the weather, and the route ahead. The pilots remain very much in command. They program the flight, monitor every system, communicate with air traffic control, and continuously evaluate weather and traffic, ready to take over instantly if anything requires a human hand or judgment the automation lacks. The most demanding phases stay firmly human. Takeoff is typically flown by hand, and while automation can assist with landings, pilots are trained and ready to manage the complex variable conditions of approach and touchdown, where experience and judgment are irreplaceable, and where a sudden gust or a wet runway demands the kind of instinct no software can fully replicate. There's another quiet secret in the same vein. The aircraft almost always carries more fuel than the bare legal minimum. The crew plans for contingencies, holding patterns, diversions, headwinds, so that running low is never a question of cutting it close. Together, these facts paint a picture of a system built around margins. Extra fuel for the unexpected automation to reduce human fatigue, and trained pilots overseeing it all, each layer compensating for the limits of the others in the pursuit of safety. So the answer to who is flying the plane is both the autopilot and the pilots working as a team, in which the machine handles the routine and the humans own the judgment, the exceptions, and the moments that truly count. But there is one thing no autopilot, no extra fuel, and no veteran pilot can reliably see coming. An invisible force that has injured travelers without a second's warning, killed a passenger in recent memory, and is, according to the science, getting worse with every passing year. The invisible killer that's getting worse. It arrives without warning, without a cloud in sight, and without registering on the weather radar. Clear air turbulence is invisible and extremely difficult to detect or predict with current onboard technology. And it is the secret the cliffhanger promised, because the data shows it is intensifying. This is the #1 entry, because it is the rare aviation hazard that is genuinely growing rather than shrinking. Most flying risks decline as technology improves. Clear air turbulence is moving the other way, driven by changes in the atmosphere itself, and the cabin is largely defenseless against it. The danger lies in its invisibility. Ordinary turbulence near storms can be seen and flown around, but clear air turbulence strikes in cloudless skies, often with no warning, hurling unrestrained people and objects violently around the cabin in a fraction of a second. That is why the crew, who are frequently up and moving, are so often the ones seriously hurt. A flight attendant in the aisle has nothing to brace against when the floor suddenly drops away, which is exactly why the seatbelt advice you ignore exists. The science behind the trend is now well documented. A peer-reviewed study found a roughly 55% increase in severe clear air turbulence over the North Atlantic between 1979 and 2020, linking it to changes in the jet stream associated with a warming climate. As the atmosphere warms, the wind shear that feeds clear air turbulence in busy flight corridors is increasing, and researchers project further rises in the years ahead. The very routes that carry the most passengers are among those expected to grow bumpier over time. Then came the moment that turned the statistic into a headline. In 2024, a Singapore Airlines flight encountered severe turbulence so violent that one passenger died and many others were seriously injured. A stark, real-world demonstration of everything the studies had been warning about. That tragedy is why this is the secret never told plainly to passengers. The calm request to keep your seatbelt fastened in case of unexpected turbulence is, in reality, the single most effective protection you have against a force that can strike a smooth, sunny flight in an instant. So the final secret is also the simplest piece of advice on this entire list. When you're seated, keep your belt loosely fastened, every time, on every flight, because the one threat the entire system cannot reliably see coming is the one you can quietly guard against yourself.